So I'm gonna show you 3 tricks to approach any hyperlapse sequence, whether you shot it handheld, on a monopod, a tripod, a gimbal, a GoPro, or even with a pigeon. But I wanna give you one quick pointer for shooting these that I think is really gonna help you out. When you're first learning, take some extra time to make sure that you have picked out what I refer to as an anchor point. Just something that you can see at the beginning and the end of your sequence. All right, so we're gonna be editing this gimbal hyperlapse as an example today. And you can see all of these windows in the frame at the beginning and the end of the shot. And one of these is gonna be my anchor point. Okay, so now that that's all sorted, let's bring our footage into After Effects and let's get started. So one of the first things people always recommend doing is just going ahead and running Warp Stabilizer. So I've run Warp Stabilizer on this piece of footage, and as you can see, it's okay, but we're not getting perfect results. So sometimes people will recommend go ahead and run Warp Stabilizer one more time. And again, the results just aren't perfect. This isn't gonna cut it if we're gonna deliver this to a client. So what we wanna do is we're gonna bring our footage into a new composition. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into my tracker panel. And if you don't see the tracker panel, just go to Window, Workspace, and Motion Tracking. And so this will bring up the tracker panel. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna look for this button called Stabilize Motion. And when we click it, it's gonna give us a track point. And the track point is gonna have an outer box, which is movable and scalable, so I can move it anywhere I want. And it's gonna give us this feature box. And if I grab it, I can also move that as well. And then it's finally gonna give us this an attach point, which I can move anywhere I want, and it doesn't have to be inside of the box, but we'll get to that at a later tip. So the first thing I wanna explain to you is that the larger this tracking area, and the tracking area is where the computer is going to search. This is the area that we are telling the computer to look for, and we're telling the computer to look for this feature. The bigger the box, the longer the computer is gonna take. Here I can see these windows, and I'm gonna go all the way to the back to the end of my sequence, and where I can see these windows again, and I'm gonna choose my anchor point. All 3 of these windows look pretty similar, and I can see these 2 in the beginning and at the end, so I'm not gonna use this window at all. And what I'm gonna do is, I like this area down here because it doesn't repeat itself. All of these details kind of repeat, so I'm just gonna put my tracking point down here in this little nook. I'm gonna make this a little bit smaller. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go into my tracker panel, and you see where it says Analyze. We have these options, and if I hover over them, you'll see Analyze 1 frame backward, Analyze backward, Analyze forward, and Analyze 1 frame forward. Since I'm at the end of the sequence, I wanna go backwards. So I'm gonna click Analyze 1 frame backward, and it doesn't look like anything happened, but if I go down here and I press U to reveal all of my keyframes, you can see that it's actually made some keyframes down here. So this is how I know that it's working. And I'm gonna press Analyze 1 frame backward just again, just to see how the track is going. Because in my experience, when we do this in the very beginning is most often when the track is gonna fall off. So I'm just clicking this and it looks pretty good. So now what I wanna do is, I think it's gonna hold up. So I'm gonna press Analyze backwards. And I'm just watching the track and it's sticking pretty well, but notice that it fall off, that it's not on the spot and it's just stopped and the computer's still going. This is something that is a big time suck. And now what I have to do is I have to navigate all the way back in my timeline and find exactly where it fell off. And then I have to start over. So what I wanna do is I wanna save time. So I'm gonna go into Options, and I'm gonna change it from Adapt Feature to Stop Tracking if the confidence is below 90%. So now if I press Analyze backwards, it ideally should stop. So there it is, and it just stopped on the track. And so now I'm just going to put it back to where it needs to go, Analyze 1 frame just to make sure it's on a good track. Not on a good track, so I'll just do it a couple more times. And press Analyze backwards. Came into the sky, it stopped. Just gonna press Analyze 1 frame back, make sure it's on a good track, and just repeat this process until the end. All right, once you're at the end of the track, what you can do is you can go ahead and click Apply dimensions to X and Y, and preview your work to see how well you did. And the results are pretty impressive, and we only spent a couple minutes doing this, which is amazing. So real quick, I wanna show you a really common problem. This is something that happens pretty often, especially if you're not paying attention. It could have a wonky track, and you could be playing it, and you see all of a sudden your track jumps like that. You notice how it just kind of jumped right there? All you need to do to fix that is just find where the jump is, double click on the layer, and then just bring your tracking point back. So now what we want to do is we're looking at our track and it looks pretty nice, but I know we can make it a little bit better. So I'm just going to pre-compose it because we can't have a motion tracking and warp stabilizer on the same layer. I'm going to pre-compose the layer by pressing Control and clicking on it and click pre-compose. And pre-compose is After Effects version of nesting for Premiere. Click OK and we'll run warp stabilizer at about 5%. All right, so these are our results with point tracking and warp stabilizer. And as you can see, that looks really, really good. And this technique is the building block for stabilizing hyperlapse sequences. And while we use it to stabilize this dolly sequence, it works the exact same way for any hyperlapse, like this trucking hyperlapse right here. So if you shot your sequence following my steps, this is gonna work for about 70% of your hyperlapses, which brings me to the next point. What if it doesn't work? So there's a reason why I recommend doing this approach first. It's honestly pretty fast, but it's also the building block of the next recipe, which is to track a point and rotation and then warp stabilize. So here's a handheld sequence from Budapest where I started with this tracking statue and the results after the tracking. They aren't bad, but when I applied warp stabilizer, the sequence got unusable by these weird wobbles. Luckily, this is an easy fix by adding rotation element to our motion tracking. So I just need to go back into the source layer, which I can do by double clicking on the composition. Then I select the sequence and press U. This is the keyboard shortcut to reveal all of the properties. And it's a time saver that I recommend getting used to because otherwise you'd have to twirl this icon, and again, hit and twirl this icon. Whereas pressing U will show you everything and pressing U again will hide everything. So you're looking for the eyeball next to the track point 1. Poke the eye to hide the track point data. And if you don't do this first, you're gonna have to retrack all of the data. We don't wanna do that, so make sure that you hide that tracking data. Now in the tracker panel, we can press rotation. This will give us a second tracking point. With this second tracking point, we need to place it somewhere that also sticks out and ideally is on a similar plane as our first tracker. And what I mean by plane is just that the second tracking point is on or as close to a straight line. If it's at a diagonal, it doesn't work quite as well. Then we track the second point just like before. Once both are tracked until it's finished, we can reveal the track point 1 by just clicking the switch for the eyeball and then click apply to see our results. Now our sequence is stabilized, and sometimes this is absolutely perfect and we don't even need to run warp stabilizer, just like this sequence. This is a perfect example. If needed, we could pre-comp this layer just like before and run warp stabilizer at a really low value like 5 to 20%. And that's awesome. So now you know how to stabilize some really tricky hyperlapse sequences and have the tools to shoot them confident like a pro. And if you're still with me, awesome. But what about sequences where things get in the way? This is a really common situation that happens all the time when we're shooting and stabilizing hyperlapses, especially if we're in a hurry and maybe we forgot to plan things out very well. And that is when something blocks our view from our anchor point. A common thing to do would be to start all over, try to find a different part of the track. But let's take a look. Here's a hyperlapse that I've shot and I'm tracking this point on the statue. Notice that the tree is blocking the way. Again, this is really common, and what we can do in these situations is go back one frame before the tree got in the way and move our tracking point somewhere else. We want to try to keep this point as close as possible so that way our perspective stays the same. And I'm choosing this spot because it's on the same plane of the building, so the movements will be similar. And it's just south of the main point. But then I'm going to take my attach point and put it back. And now when I track forward, my attach point is in the right spot and I can keep tracking until my feature point is now in the trees. But I know that's not a problem because I can just move everything back and continue. And you can do this as many times as you need. The key thing to remember is you're gonna have best results if you keep the feature region close as possible to its original spot. All right. And with the end of that video, that covers all the stabilization techniques for hyperlapses. I recommend getting some practice. If you can't get out and shoot, use my sequences to practice with and get comfortable with the post-processing. I think seeing the stabilization really helps visualize exactly what you need to be doing when you're shooting. So if you have any questions at all about stabilizing footage, please let me know. And if you learned anything from this video or it helped you save any time, I'd consider subscribing to this YouTube channel, get those notifications going. Let me know what hyperlapse questions you have next. And that is it for today. Happy shooting and I'll see you next time. Check out last week's video where I showed you how to do this cool hyper zoom technique. So lastly, if you want to learn more about time-lapse and hyperlapse photography, I do have a course called Hyperflow Masterclass where I teach everything I've ever learned about time-lapse and hyperlapse and blending them all together and to make these seamless videos. Well, that's it for this video. Happy shooting, and I'll see you next time.